Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Filion and you can find me as Pixel Princess on the Sketchy app. Welcome to lesson 2 of Portraits in Procreate Mastering Media. Today we're going to cover painting techniques and we're going to be discussing how to use traditional methods of painting with oil and acrylics and how those can be mimicked with the digital tools found in Procreate. In this lesson, you'll also get a detailed tip on how to paint eyes, change your brush dynamics to create painterly effects, use the Liquify tool, as well as work with layers. So let's get started. Okay, so since today's lesson is all about painting techniques, I've already started with my rough sketch. And I have my source image ready here, and it comes from the Sketchy app, and it's a beautiful colored image that I've chosen to be inspired by for painting. So I'll just show you guys what I've done with layers so far. So I started out with a very rough sketch. So just trying to rough in my proportions. I used a technical pencil in order to just, again, try to capture those proportions of the face as well as the hand. So using really broken, sketchy, rough lines. And then what I did was I clicked on the N in my layer panel and I reduced the opacity quite a bit to about 16–17%. And then I created a new layer called Face Sketch. And for this new layer, I traced over my lines, but I also paid particular attention to details and, again, adjusting proportions as I went in order to get it just right. And for this one, I only focused on the face. I didn't do the hand because I want to keep my hand on a separate layer. And I like to do that when you have foreground and background elements because it can really help you later on when you go to add your color in your painting. For this layer, I chose to do it in a different color. So I don't know if you can tell, but it is a deep plum kind of color. And so I wanted to do something again that works with the image since we're focusing on color and painting today. And then my next layer is the hand layer, and again I used that same deep plum color. I mostly used an HB pencil with some 6B components for the darker areas for this sketch. And so then once I am finished with roughing that in, I'm going to uncheck my original sketch layer so that I have a nice clean sketch to work with for painting. So what I've done next is I've actually created a palette of the color scheme from my source image, so inspired by the image. And to do that, I actually created a new canvas. You could do it on the same canvas, but I didn't want it to be recorded in my time-lapse video, so I chose to open a new canvas, simply import the photo. And in my palettes, I created a new palette by clicking on the plus button, set that palette to default. I called it analogous purples because this is what's known as an analogous color scheme because all of the colors are beside each other on the color wheel. So we have purples, reds, pinks, which are kind of a color family. And then what I've done is I've simply tapped on parts of the image and I dropped the different colors and then dropped them into my palette. So now I have a nice palette full of the colors that I'm going to use for my painting. So now that we've created our palette, we're ready to start painting. So what I'm going to start out doing first is select my background color, and on my layer panel, I'm going to go to background color and change it to purple. Now, what you'll notice right away is that my sketch disappears because I did make that sketch the exact same color. So I'm going to adjust my background color just ever so slightly so I can still see my sketch, and I can change it back to a different color later on. Okay, so now I have a beautiful background, and one benefit of doing it this way, especially when you're working with color in a more artistic or painterly way, is that you've laid down a ground to work from. So this purple color, or whatever color your background happens to be, can actually radiate up through the portrait. So I kind of like actually some of these like red and more neon tones. So I'm actually going to go in here again to my background color and I'm actually going to make it more red, and then I can go around and make it purple later on for the background, but this is so that I can get that nice glowy effect that I see in my source image. So one of the goals of this course is to be able to take traditional methods of painting and apply them with digital tools. So in traditional painting, especially when you're working with thicker mediums such as acrylic paint or oil paint, you would lay down, like I said before, a background color to work from. And then depending on what kind of paint you're working with, you may want that color to, blend into your paints, or you may want to let it dry and then work over top of it. So if you're working with oil takes a long time to dry, and so generally speaking, you're using oil because you want to be able to continuously mix those colors seamlessly. So let's start by doing kind of an oil technique. So if I go to Artistic, and I click on oil paint and click into the properties of it, I'm going to go to Dynamics, and right now it is already set to wet mix. So what this means is that as I start building up color layers, it's going to continuously blend those layers, just like in real life when you're working with oil paint. So if yours isn't set to that already, I would set it to wet mix because that's going to give you the most realistic results. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer, and I'm going to rename this color, or this layer, sorry, oil paint. And I'm going to select kind of a mid-tone of her skin tone here. And for this first layer, I'm going to work below my sketch. And then later on, when I start building up details, I'll work above my sketch layer. So we're just going to add in the oil paint, and you can see how it's already blending with the background color, which I love because this is similar to the effect that you would get in real life using oil paint. So that's that wet mix. And then over here, we actually see more of that red color showing through, so I won't go as thick in that area. So I'm just going to block in the areas where it's less red. Okay, so something like that. Then I'm going to choose a darker shade in order to add the dark areas to, for example, the jawbone. And again, on that wet mix mode, you do have to be careful. Even the way that you smear the paint onto the canvas will have different results. So if I go from down to up in my strokes, I'm getting more of that dark paint, but if I start going in this direction, I'm actually blending in that color that I had just laid down. So it really is like working with traditional tools. And I actually am going to add a bit more to the ear here. So we're just going to keep blending that paint until we get the effect that we want. So we have some darker areas around the eyes. And under the chin. And for now, I'm actually not worried about painting over my hand sketch because I'm going to do that on a different layer. So we won't worry about the hand for now. Zoom in on the eye here. When working with a painterly brush, you can see that it really does have that effect of using a paintbrush. The strokes aren't perfectly blended. And so, of course, if you want something a little bit more precise, you can choose either a different brush, a different medium, or you could modify this brush to make it exactly the way that you would want it. So I'm just adding in the highlights. And her hair is fairly light here, so I'll lay down a bit of white in this area as a base. Okay, so this is starting to get the effect of oil paint or painted medium. So I'll keep working on this and then we'll try out another type of paint next. So far we have our oil paint kind of brushed in a really rough kind of way. So now I want to show you guys how to just add details and refine certain parts of the image. So we're going to really focus in on one of probably the most important parts of any portrait, which is the eye area. So what I'm going to do, and you can choose any brush of your choice that you're comfortable with. I'm going to choose the round brush to start off with. I'm going to make my brush pretty small, but have my opacity fairly high. And I'm going to just have it be a very dark brown. So I'm looking at my source photo carefully to try to kind of mimic the tones that I see in there. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new layer that's above our sketch layer. So I'm just going to call this face paint. And with the brown, we're going to block in the top portion of the eye. So her lash line at the top is fairly dark. She's got brown eyes too, so we can continue to use this brown to kind of outline the iris here. I'm going to add that crease into her eye also with the brown. And then under her eye, there's some eyeliner too that we'll just kind of put in. And then I'm going to switch to a slightly lighter brown. For the iris. And the underneath portion of the eye here, I want to make it look really 3D. So even just changing the tone slightly, if you can kind of see in the source photo how it's a little bit darker on top and then a little bit lighter at the bottom, just those really fine details can really change the look of a portrait and make it look more natural and more 3D. I'm going to change to black in order to do the pupil. And not worry too much of going over top of my highlight because I'm going to put that in last. If you look at the whites of the eyes too, in this particular portrait, they're not pure white because of the color of the portrait is very vibrant. So they actually have a bit of a pink-red kind of glow to them. So we will add that in a second, but I'm going to start out with a more traditional color and then work my way from there. Reduce my opacity so that I can start to blend my colors together a bit more. You can see a little bit of that light kind of shining into the eye as well. What I'm doing right now is on pretty low opacity and with a really light touch of my pencil. I'm adding a bit of shading to the top of the eye because our eyes are hooded. This part would be in shadow here, generally speaking. And same with the corners of the eyes too. They're going to be a little bit darker just to suggest the roundness of our eyeball. And I'm trying to put in more of that kind of pink tone as well. You can also, instead of dragging your brush the whole time too, another tip that I want to offer you is to use it like a stamp. So in areas where you really want some nice blending, especially if you use a soft brush, you can kind of stamp in your details and it just has this really nice blending effect. And on the upper lid, we're just going to notice that this outer corner is really sparkly and highlighted. And then this one is more in shadow. And it's back to that pinky red kind of color. And then where they blend in the middle is brown. So right now my round brush is set to wet mix. I normally actually have it on glazed. It's kind of my preferred mode, but because we're doing a more painterly technique and style, I want my colors to blend seamlessly together. So having it on wet mix is a really nice option. And then I don't even have to use my smudge tool. I can kind of naturally blend my various values together. And even though I've created that palette that we can go back to, once you've started with a base of the colors you're using, you'll find that you're using the color picker option more and more. At least I do. That's kind of my workflow because it just is so much simpler than always going back to your palette. So I like to think about this too, for those of you who are familiar with oil painting techniques, even though we're not using an oil paint brush per se right now, we're doing something really similar that you would do in glazing, especially in oil paint, even in acrylic. You can mix acrylic paints with glazed mediums and get a similar kind of result too. So it's just kind of using that wet mix mode on your brushes to seamlessly blend these values together. So hopefully that gives you an idea of blending. Now, even though it is really nice and soft, and that is a certain style and effect that a lot of artists might strive for, you might want to add some more texture to it in order to, again, keep with kind of the realism of the portrait. So I'll show you guys how to do that too, but before we get there, I'll just finish the eyebrow so we can call this eye complete. So I'm again just blocking in a darker shade, and I find with any kind of hair, it can be really useful to start out with the darkest value and then work your way to the lightest value. And we're actually going to switch off of our round brush and switch to our sketching pencil. I'm going to choose an HB pencil and start adding some eyebrow hairs. It's going to be kind of subtle, so I've zoomed right in so that you can see. And I'm just paying attention to the direction of the hairs. So in the corner here, horizontal hairs. And then as they switch over the eye, or sorry, in the corner here, vertical hairs, and as they switch over the eye, horizontal. And I want to add some more highlighted hairs to this part of the eyebrow here that's in lighting. And I like using a brush or a pencil with some texture for these parts of the portraits because our eyebrow hairs naturally, of course, do have a texture to them. They're not perfectly smooth like we might find with a paintbrush. The oil paintbrush, if you're looking for a painting medium, is also going to do something similar. So I'm going to switch back to artistic and to oil paint. Another brush that has a lot of texture is the turpentine brush, or under painting, the old brush as well. So we'll go back to artistic oil paint, and I'm going to select a lighter color. I'm going to take my oil paint brush down so it's quite small. And what I love about this is how the strokes of the oil paint brush, when the size of the brush is really small, gives you that nice texture that does look like natural hairs. And then you could use some bigger strokes too to block in areas that are darker. And blend those together. So our eyebrow is looking pretty good. Let's try one more brush. We'll try that old brush. So under painting, old brush. Make it pretty small. And just in the corner here, I'm actually gonna put some white hairs in to show the highlights. Okay, so our eyebrow is looking pretty decent. So now I want to add some texture to kind of mimic the nice highlighted area of her makeup here. So what I'm going to do now, and feel free to, if you want to work on separate layers, you could add a texture layer as well and go over top of that. So that's another option. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to spray paint, and you could use splatter or flicks. I kind of like using the flicks because they're a little bit larger and a bit more dramatic. So I'm going to choose white for my brush, and I can get a preview of the flicks and about the size that I want. I'm going to reduce the opacity a bit and just use them to highlight the brow bone. So you can already see that it's creating an effect that looks like a shine, but it has that texture of skin. We can do it down here as well. It's a little bit peachy in this corner, so I'm going to add some flecks that are peach colored. And same with up here. So you're just going to go back and forth to blend in these colors seamlessly. And if you want it a bit more dramatic, you can increase the size or the opacity. So it's fun to play around with finding exactly what works for you. And I mean, there's other brushes that you can try out too. Under touch-ups, there's actually a skin kind of brush too that you can use. There's of course the other spray paint brush that I mentioned to you, air brushes too. I have some artist friends who just love the airbrush tools in Procreate. So, you know, it's part of it is experimenting with what works the best. And I'm constantly trying to find new ways to approach portraits and experimenting with new brushes, although I do have my kind of favorites that I tend to go back to. Okay, so we'll do a little bit more of the peach tone in here because we're losing some of that. Okay, so that's adding a little bit of texture to it. So now what I'm going to do is actually add a new layer for the eyelashes. And the reason why I often like to add eyelashes on a separate layer from the face paint is because eyelashes are something that sticks out from the portrait. And so if I want the ability to be able to go back and adjust the value of the eyelid later, it just makes it so much easier if the eyelashes are on a separate layer. So I'm going to take a dark brown / black color, and there's a few different options for eyelashes that I find tend to look pretty natural. Any of the sketching pencils look pretty natural. Some of the ink pens and even calligraphy pens, like the shale brush, for example, looks pretty natural. And then of course, any of the painting tools as well. So even oil paint, again, could be pretty natural for eyelashes. Let's try right now the shale brush that's under calligraphy and see if we like that effect. So you got to find, you know, again, the right opacity and brush size that works for your portrait. With eyelashes, you might want to start right in the center of the eye. So eyelashes, of course, come from underneath. So we want to make sure we're giving it that effect visually. So it doesn't look like they're just sitting over top. So starting in the middle, and then as it goes towards the corner, the tear duct of the eye, they're going to point in that direction. And then as it goes towards the outer edge of the eye, they're going to point in this direction. And in the middle generally is where they kind of change directions. So that's why starting in the middle can sometimes be useful. So just adding them in to add a little bit of, again, texture for the eyelashes. And so I'll put them in the bottom as well. And the key to making eyelashes looking natural is sometimes to have some that are a little bit rogue, that are a little bit longer than others. And again, the directions, making them not so perfect that they tend to look unnatural or fake. So something like that. Now, I do kind of want to blend out that bottom a little bit, so I have a few options. I could take my smudge tool and I could change it to something like a round brush, something with minimal texture, and I could just kind of smudge out the lash line so that it's not so harsh. Another thing, if I want to smudge out the entire portrait, that I could do is I could try one of my blur tools. Gaussian blur is kind of a go-to for me. So if I slide it to the right, you can see if I blur it too much, the eyelashes completely disappear. So if I just blur them out a little bit, they might look a little bit more natural. So I'll keep it somewhere in there. And then of course, again, as a layering effect, if I want some to stand out more than others, I can go back and just add it to a little bit of texture to certain ones, so they're not all like that. So I want to work on the pupil a little bit more before we finish up the eye. So I'm going to go back to a round brush. I'm going to fix the crease too of this eye here. And sorry, I'm going to go to my paint layer actually to do that. So this is where I was talking about before, why it's useful to have your eyelashes on a different layer, because now I can still go back and I can still modify the lid behind and it's not affecting the eyelash layer, except that I'm on the eyelash layer. Hold on. And always check your layers so that you know what layer you're on. So yeah, I can just go back in and shade that eyelid without affecting the eyelashes. So right now I feel like this fleck of light looks a little bit like it's sitting on top, which I do want that effect of a light source, but I want it to be exactly the way that I want it. So I'm going to put in a few little flecks there. That has a bit of red in it. Again, having your brush set to wet mix is really useful. And seeing what effects you can kind of create to make that eye look really interesting. So I showed you that you can use the smudger and smudge areas out here. You can also do that to do some fine-tuning of adjustments. And what I would also like to do is add a little bit more of dramatic light source to this. So I'm going to go to my brushes. I'm going to go to luminance and select light flare and turn my color to white. And that would be a huge flare, so I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Okay, so something like that. Again, you could do this on a separate layer to really be able to fine tune it. And I'm going to take my smudge tool and just kind of blur out the edges a little bit. If you did it on another layer, you could use Gaussian blur once again to do that. There we go. So now what we've done is we've created a fairly natural, painterly looking eye using some of the brush tools in Procreate. Okay, so now that we have shaded in our face paint layer, we are going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it hand paint. And if you do have part of the body or part of the picture that comes on top of your face, so a hand being a good example of that, I always like to work on a separate layer because it just gives you the maximum number of flexibility. It also means that when you're painting the face, you can block in the shading and the painting in a more natural way, so you can see that for the most part, I did go around it, but you can see there are parts where I went over top of it in order to get that line nice and smooth. If you did it on the same layer, it would be really hard to have that kind of continuous look on the face without kind of painstakingly going around the hand. So it is a nice practice to use your layers in that way. So I'm going to kind of rough in the color in a similar way that we started with the face. So I'm going to take kind of a dominant color of the hand, so one of the midtones, and make sure that I'm on that hand layer. And I'm just going to move my opacity up and color it in. So this is opacity at 100%. So I'm going to make sure that my layer is completely filled in. Can make my brush a little bit bigger to fill in these sections. And you can use any brush that's comfortable for you. But for this, I am using the round brush just because I want something that I can get pretty opaque and color in fairly quickly with. Okay, so I've blocked in the hand, and just by doing that, already you get that sense that it is over top of the face. So even without any shading added to it, we've already kind of given it that effect. So then I want to shade it in. I'm going to use my background color to get that nice glow. So I'm going to reduce the opacity on my brush. I'm actually going to reduce it more than what it is here, so quite a bit. And so I've already, with my sketch layer, blocked in a little bit of where I was planning on putting my shading. So now I'm just following some of those guidelines and of course still looking at my source picture. What I have removed is, you can see another finger in the source picture. I don't think I'm going to add that in, so that's just a decision that I've decided to make. So the areas that are a little bit darker, I'm just going to go over them. Now I'm going to take a color that will be my highlighted layer. And I find artists have different practices for, you know, what kind of order they shade in, and sometimes it changes depending on, you know, what the portrait is or what I'm drawing. But right now I'm showing you kind of a method where I started with a mid-tone, then I'm doing like some of my shadowy kind of glow areas, and I'm also doing my highlights. So I'm doing them in that order, but I'm going to go back and forth between all of the different shades, tints, and tones. So I want to put in some of those highlights, and then I'm going to take a darker color to do my lowlights or my shading. So right now you'll notice that my hand painting layer is actually below my hand sketch layer. So if I wanted to remove my sketch lines, I could drag it over top, or even better, I could create a new layer, kind of like what I did with the face. And again, just rename that hand paint. And now I'm going to start working on a layer that's over top in order to just cover up some of those sketch lines and do a few more precise details. Okay guys, so now that we have smoothed in our shading for both the face and the hand, now, you know, this is the first technique, which would be considered a wet mix. The second technique I want to do is a more painterly approach, which would be more of like an impasto or kind of textured style of painting. So that's what we're going to experiment with next. the first thing I want to do is go down to my first layer, and I'm going to create a new layer and actually drag it so that it's just above that background color. And I'm going to rename this background. And then what I'm going to do is select the purple color that I had initially wanted for my background. And I'm going to take a nice large brush. I'm going to use this Nico one and bring up the opacity. And I'm just going to go around my portrait and put in my background color. And I kind of want to keep a little bit of the bright red showing through, but I definitely want it to be more purple. I want to make it a little bit brighter. So I'm going to try a flat brush as well. Go into my flat brush settings, and if I click on general, see how it says size limits here? I'm going to make this quite a bit bigger brush because I am working on an 11 by 14 inch canvas at 300 dpi. So depending on the size of your canvas, the max size of your brush is going to be affected. So I'm going to make this brush pretty huge so that it's kind of ideal, kind of like a giant paintbrush that you would use just like in traditional art for a background. I want to get just the right color of purple. I like that purple. Kind of go in different directions. Maybe select some of that red background and bring it back in. You could do that with an eraser as well, so using your eraser as a tool. So I kind of like something like that. I'm going to put in a bit of more of like a shadowed effect behind her head, just to set her off from the canvas a little bit, and also a little bit behind the hand. And then I'll just kind of brush over those. Give it a nice natural painterly effect, and we can go back into this and kind of tweak that a little bit more. So now I feel like she's really popping from the canvas. It also allows us to see where we might want to clean up some of our lines. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to merge some layers at this point because I don't necessarily need to work on them individually anymore. So I'm going to take my face paint layer and merge down, merge down, merge down, and I'm going to rename this face. Put the eyelashes on top still, and then I'll do the same thing with my hand and just merge it down, and I'm simply going to call it hand. Now I could have combined my layers as well, but again, only merge them if you're confident that you don't need to work on them individually anymore. So now I'm down to 4 layers. I have my background color, my face, eyelashes are still a separate layer for now because I might want to tweak that, and then my hand layer being the top layer. So on the face layer, there are some parts that are not perfect, but because we're going to be doing some painterly effects, I'm not going to worry about that too much. But if, depending on what style you're doing, you could take your eraser at this point, now that you've merged your layers and making sure that you're on the face sketch, you could go in and just clean up any edges. So that would be an option, right? And because we've also merged the sketch layer as well, that would really help you to get rid of anything that you're not happy with. So I'll show you an example in the hand here too. So into my hand, just make my brush a little bit larger. I'm actually going to go in, right now my eraser is set to a 6B pencil, so I'm actually going to change that to a flat brush. Oops. Sometimes it's a trick to find the right size because I had modified that brush. So now just go in and clean up those lines. And her wrist shape too, I'm noticing I have a little bit too much of an angle. So I'm going to change the angle on that wrist as well and make it look a little bit more like my source picture. Okay, so we could do that. We could clean those things up with the face shape. Maybe I'll just quickly do that here. And then what I want to do next is above the face and the eyelashes, I'm going to create a hair layer. And I want to keep it pretty painterly, so it's not going to be realistic so much as it is going to be kind of my interpretation of the hair. So I'm going to take an old brush and take kind of in this like beigey gold tone of her hair. And I'm just going to add some texture and some kind of dimension to this hair. By doing it on a separate layer, again, it gives me some flexibility to change it and modify it later. I'm going to go to something a little bit more pure white for this area that's really highlighted and glowing. And then I'll go darker for this area up here. And we're going to work more expressively on our next layers here. So in a more painterly kind of fashion. Okay, so I have some hair put in there. I also want to add a shirt. And to do that, again, I kind of want to do something a little bit more painterly. So I'm going to try my damp brush and choose kind of a nice pinky purple tone for the shirt. So I'll start with the pink and then I'll change to the purple. Again, I'm going to go into damp brush properties and change the max size just to make it a little bit larger. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mask off the shirt. And technically I don't really need to do this because the shirt is underneath all of the other layers. But this way, I'm adding to selection. So now what I've done is I've masked off everything that isn't the shirt. And the reason for this is so that I can kind of do some more expressive brush strokes and then not worried about having to clean it up later on. So with my damp brush, the damp brush really does have that effect of, like it's called, a damp brush. So you can use it like a stamp. You can also use it to drag it across the canvas and it will definitely give a nice blurred effect. There's a bit of a kind of a lighting stripe through her shirt here. And you can see it has that smudge kind of built into it. So maybe something like that. Unselect my selection. And if you do need to clean it up with an eraser, you can. But what I'm also going to do is actually move the shirt above my face layer now, because I want to cover up some of the spots that I'm not happy with here. I'll just kind of quickly suggest a shirt. And then on my face layer, I'm going to actually play around with some of the smudge tool features. So in smudge tool, we could go to oil paint, for example. And if you click into its properties under general, again, you can change the max size and play with that. But you'll also notice there's a smudge property for all of your brushes. So I would recommend playing around with that smudge property, especially when you're using the smudge tool itself, because that's really going to affect how much it's going to actually blend and smudge out. So you have lots of brush behaviors here. Under blend mode, it's in normal, but there are also different options under here for you to kind of play around with as well. So smudge, I'm going to reduce it just a little bit, and we'll kind of see that effect. So what I'm going to do, and reduce my brush opacity, is I'm going to, on that skin layer, just make things a little less perfect and play around with some of the smudging features. I mean, we spent all that time blending, so I'm not going to go too crazy, but I want to make it more painterly. And you can go back and forth to your layers. So on the shirt layer, I think I want something with a little bit more texture, so I'm going to go to turpentine. There we go, I kind of like that texture a bit better. And turpentine, of course, is something you can use with oil paints, with real life oil paints, to help blend and glaze. Same with my background layer. You can smudge your background colors as well. My hair layer. Reduce the opacity. And then my hand layer. I like to use a combination of a stamping, so you can hear my brush click, and also dragging the brush. The stamping gives really nice texture. And again, that kind of painterly effect that we're going for. And depends how extreme you want to go. I just brought that opacity way up, and it can be very dramatic. Kind of like that idea of adding more texture to certain areas of the skin, so I'm going to use it like a stamp. And this is where, when I'm going around the mouth area, right, where the hand's covered up, this is why it's important that I still kept the hand on a separate layer from the face, so that I can get kind of these effects behind the hand. And then you could merge them too if you decided that you wanted them more to blend together. I love the way this looks stamped. Like that kind of effect where you're really pulling colors from the surrounding area. It almost gives the effect you would have if you were scraping something along your canvas, or like a palette knife, for example, or if you were taking a dry brush and using that. So what I'm trying to do is kind of get rid of the outlines, make it look more painterly. Just makes it more organic, more expressive, more painterly. And then on the shirt here, I kind of like the effect where it starts to, you can start to see some of the colors through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on my eraser tool, and I'm really loving that turpentine brush. So I'm going to go to Artistic Turpentine. I'm going to change the max size of my brush. For the smudge effect, I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Reduce the opacity. And I'm just going to use it again as a stamp to kind of bring in a bit more color in certain spots. And it's a back and forth layering once again until we get it exactly the way we want it. Even on the background layer, you can bring in some of that nice color that we had before. Now we have a really nice kind of painterly effect. Okay, last but not least, I'm going to use the Liquify tool just to add finishing touches to my painting. So under Adjustments, I'm going to select Liquify. And I'm going to use the Push tool with a smaller brush size, so around 29 right now, and not a very high pressure, 45%. And what I'm going to do is I'm paying attention to certain features of the face that might have gotten a little bit skewed in kind of the brush work that I did. So I'm going to, with the Liquify tool, just fix up those areas to make it more proportional. And there you have it, guys. With a few simple clicks, we have improved the overall proportions of the portrait. So guys, when you come to the final stage of your portrait, have a little bit of fun with it. This is the time to take a look at it, and if there's anything that doesn't quite sit right with you, feel free to experiment on new layers. So I'm thinking I'm gonna simplify my background so that my portrait layer stands out a little bit more. So I've added another layer of paint to the background. On the face layer, I can continue to kind of add a little bit of a painterly kind of glow effect around the face. And then something else that I was thinking about adding is maybe a little bit of an abstract design as well. So keep working on it, have fun with your portraits, experiment with different brush styles and different brush strokes in order to get those painterly effects. Well guys, that concludes today's lesson. Thank you so much for drawing with me today.